The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Elite Medical Center were practically blinding, reflecting off the polished marble floors of the city's most prestigious civilian trauma ward. To the affluent patients who came here, it was a sanctuary of high-end care. To 42-year-old Elias Thorne, the hospital's newest registered nurse, it was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful retirement. Elias stood quietly near Trauma Bay 4, meticulously organizing a sterile instrument tray. He wore standard, slightly faded blue scrubs that hung off his broad, weathered frame. His face bore the subtle, map-like lines of a man who had spent too much time in the unforgiving desert sun, but his eyes, a piercing, calm gray, were fixed entirely on the gauze and hemostats. "Thorne, are you sleeping standing up again?" The sharp, nasal voice cut through the hum of the emergency room. Dr. Julian Vance strode down the corridor, his custom-tailored dark gray scrubs perfectly pressed, a monogrammed stethoscope draped effortlessly over his neck. Vance was St. Jude's golden boy, a brilliant 30-something Ivy League trauma surgeon whose surgical skill was matched only by his towering, suffocating ego. Elias paused, his hands perfectly steady, and turned to face the surgeon. "No, Dr. Vance, I am prepping Bay 4 for the incoming transfer." Vance scoffed, snatching the clipboard from the end of the bed and tossing it onto the pristine tray Elias had just organized. The metal clattered loudly. "You prep a tray like an amateur, Thorne. Everything is out of order. Did they even teach you basic spatial organization at whatever strip mall nursing school you dragged yourself out of?" Before Elias could answer, charge nurse Brenda materialized beside Vance. She was a stern, perpetually scowling woman who ran the nursing staff with a toxic mix of favoritism and cruelty. "I apologize, Dr. Vance," Brenda said, shooting Elias a look of absolute disgust. "I told administration it was a mistake hiring a mature graduate with zero real-world trauma experience. He's too slow for a level 1 center. I'll have one of the senior nurses redo the tray." "Just make sure he stays out of my way," Vance sneered, checking his diamond-encrusted Rolex. "I have a VIP consultation in 20 minutes, and I don't want this geriatric rookie fumbling instruments and ruining my save rate when the minor traumas roll in." Elias said absolutely nothing. He didn't flinch, he didn't defend himself. He simply looked at the disorganized tray, his jaw tightening just a fraction of an inch. Inside, the muscle memory of a man who had successfully clamped a shredded femoral artery in the pitch black of an Afghan cave while under heavy mortar fire begged to be let out. He had worked alongside the most lethal, highly trained men on the planet, men who would have leveled buildings if spoken to the way Dr. Vance just spoke to him. But Elias just took a slow, measured breath. "Quiet life," he reminded himself. "You left the war behind. Swallow the pride." "Understood, Dr. Vance," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that lacked even a trace of intimidation. "I'll stay out of the way." Vance rolled his eyes, turning his back on Elias completely. "See that you do, rookie. Leave the heavy lifting to the professionals." Brenda shoved a plastic bucket of sanitizing wipes into Elias's chest. "Go sanitize the waiting room chairs. Try not to mess that up." Elias took the bucket, his rough, calloused fingers gripping the cheap plastic. He turned to walk toward the waiting room, fully prepared to endure another day of mind-numbing disrespect, when the atmosphere in the ER suddenly shattered. It started as a low, piercing tone, not the standard yellow alarm for an incoming ambulance. It was the harsh, blaring red siren of the hospital's disaster network, a sound the staff hadn't heard in 5 years. The overhead speakers crackled violently, the dispatcher's voice tight with raw, unfiltered panic. "Code black, code black. All trauma teams to the ambulance bay. Mass-casualty event on Interstate 95. Multiple military transport vehicles overturned. Active fire, severe trauma. ETA is 2 minutes. I repeat, incoming wounded are critical." Dr. Vance froze, his smug expression instantly melting from his face. The clipboard slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. "Wait, military transport? How many?" Vance stammered, his eyes darting toward the heavy double doors of the ambulance bay. Outside, the faint, terrifying wail of a dozen approaching sirens began to bleed through the walls, growing louder by the second. Elias stopped in his tracks. He slowly set the bucket of wipes down on the floor.
The stoic, submissive posture he had held all morning vanished, his shoulders squared, his posture straightening as a chilling, absolute calm washed over his eyes. The war hadn't stayed behind. It had just found him again.
The automatic doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open, they were violently thrown apart. A wave of freezing night air rushed into the pristine trauma center, carrying with it the undeniable acrid stench of diesel fuel, burnt rubber, and charred tactical gear. "Move! Move! We need 4 trauma bays now!" a soot-stained paramedic screamed, sprinting alongside a gurney, his boots squeaking wildly against the polished marble. Behind him, a chaotic procession of stretchers poured into the corridor. The patients weren't the usual affluent civilians of St. Jude's. They were young men in shredded olive-drab fatigues and heavy plate carriers. A military transport convoy had been T-boned by a semi-truck on the interstate, flipping a heavily armored transport vehicle multiple times. "Code Black Protocol!" Nurse Brenda yelled, her voice shrill and unhelpful as she frantically waved a clipboard, completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of blood and noise. "Bays 1 through 4. Keep the civilian waiting room locked down." Dr. Julian Vance stood frozen for a split second, his expensive stethoscope suddenly feeling very heavy around his neck. He was used to single car collisions and the occasional sports injury. He was not used to a literal war zone rolling into his lobby. Swallowing his hesitation, Vance forced his chest out, masking his panic with pure arrogance. "I'm lead trauma. Bring the most critical to Bay 1. Let's go, people." Elias Thorne stood near the supply cart, his eyes tracking the chaos in slow motion. The room was a blur of panicking nurses and shouting EMTs, but to Elias, the noise faded into a familiar, rhythmic hum. His mind shifted gears, locking into a terrifyingly calm state that he hadn't accessed in years. He wasn't looking at the dirt or the commotion. His eyes instantly scanned for mechanisms of injury, blood loss rates, and airway compromises. The gurney shoved into Bay 1 held a young soldier, barely 22, his uniform ripped open to expose a battered, bruised chest. He was gasping frantically, his lips tinted a dangerous ashen shade of blue. "Talk to me," Vance commanded, snapping on a pair of sterile gloves, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the sheer severity of the trauma. "Blunt force trauma to the chest, possible crush injury from the armored hull. Heart rate is 140, O2 saturation is plummeting down to 78. He can't breathe." All right, get him on a monitor. Push 100 mics of fentanyl," Vance ordered, his pitch pitching higher as the monitor began to shriek. He grabbed a standard oxygen mask and slammed it over the soldier's face. "Start a central line. He's going into shock from internal bleeding. We need to prep for an emergency thoracotomy. Someone page the surgical team." Elias, standing just outside the curtain, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He watched the glowing monitor. The soldier's heart rate was spiking wildly, and the oxygen mask wasn't doing a damn thing. The right side of the young man's chest was completely rigid, not rising with his desperate gasps for air, and his neck veins were beginning to bulge severely. "It's not just internal bleeding, you fool," Elias thought, his jaw clenching. "It's a textbook tension pneumothorax. His lung has collapsed, and trapped air is crushing his heart." "Dr. Vance!" a young, terrified junior nurse squeaked. "His blood pressure is tanking, 70/40. The oxygen isn't working." "I know that," Vance snapped, his perfectly manicured image cracking under the pressure. Sweat beading on his forehead. "The impact ruptured something major. Where is that central line? We need to crack his chest open right now and find the bleeder or he's dead." "Sir, you can't crack his chest yet," the paramedic warned, looking frantically between the crashing monitor and the sweating surgeon. "We haven't stabilized his airway." "I give the orders here," Vance roared, his ego demanding control over a situation that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. He reached for a scalpel on the tray. "Hold him down. I'm making the incision." If Vance made that massive, invasive incision now, the sudden pressure shift, combined with the unaddressed tension pneumothorax, would send the soldier into immediate, irreversible cardiac arrest. He would kill the boy in seconds. Elias stepped forward.
The stoic, submissive demeanor of the rookie nurse vanished completely. The heavy, measured footsteps that now approached Bay 1 belonged to a Tier 1 operator who had stared death in the face 1,000 times and never blinked. "Dr. Vance," Elias's voice cut through the screaming and the alarms. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, commanding authority that made the room instantly freeze. Vance looked up, scalpel in hand, his eyes wide with furious disbelief. "Thorne, I told you to stay out of my way. Security!" Elias didn't stop. He crossed the threshold of the trauma bay, his eyes locked dead on the dying soldier. "Put the scalpel down, Doctor, before you murder this kid."
"Are you out of your mind, Thorne?" Vance screamed, his face flushing a furious mottled crimson. "Security, get this arrogant, geriatric orderly out of my trauma bay right now. He's contaminating the field." Elias didn't even flinch. He moved with a sudden, fluid speed that defied his age and entirely shattered his sluggish reputation. In 2 massive strides, he bypassed the sputtering surgeon, placing his broad, immovable frame squarely between Vance and the dying soldier. Nurse Brenda lunged forward, her face twisted in rage, grabbing a fistful of Elias's scrub top. "Thorne, you are fired. Step away from the patient this instant." Elias didn't yell. He didn't have to. He simply turned his head, his cold gray eyes locking onto Brenda's. The submissive rookie was gone. In his place stood an apex predator. "Touch me again, Brenda, and you'll be the second patient in this room. Step back." His voice was a low, terrifying rumble, vibrating with the undeniable weight of a man who had ended lives in the name of saving others. Brenda physically recoiled, her hands dropping to her sides, as if the fabric of his scrubs had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled backward, bumping into a supply cart, entirely speechless. Elias turned his full attention back to the soldier. The boy's lips were cyanotic, a terrifying, deathly shade of blue. The heart monitor shrieked a frantic, deadly rhythm. 150 beats per minute, blood pressure at 60/30 and plummeting toward the floor. Vance waved the scalpel wildly from the sidelines, trying to reclaim his authority. "He's bleeding out internally. His pressure is tanking. I have to open his chest and clamp the bleeder." "He is suffocating, you arrogant fool," Elias barked, his hands flying over the soldier's battered chest with practiced mechanical precision. "Look at his neck. Severe jugular venous distension. Look at his trachea. It's deviated to the left. His right lung has completely collapsed from the blunt force trauma, trapping pressurized air in the pleural cavity. It's a textbook tension pneumothorax. It is crushing his heart and his left lung. If you slice his chest open now, the sudden pressure differential will stop his heart instantly. You will kill him." The room went deathly silent, the only sound the blaring alarms of the cardiac monitor. Vance stared at the soldier's neck, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He hadn't seen it. Blinded by panic in his own towering ego, the Golden Boy surgeon had missed the most basic fatal combat injury. "Give me a 14-gauge angiocatheter," Elias snapped, holding out his gloved hand without looking up. "Now." The young, terrified junior nurse, mesmerized by Elias's sudden, overwhelming command of the room, slapped the long, thick needle into his palm without a single thought of the hospital's strict hierarchy. "Thorne, you are not authorized for invasive," Vance stammered, his voice cracking. "Shut up," Elias commanded. He didn't bother with sterile drapes or iodine swabs. The luxury of a sterile field did not exist when a soldier had seconds left to live. He found the second intercostal space on the right side, mid-clavicular line, his fingers guided purely by the muscle memory of 1,000 similar emergencies in the blood-soaked dirt of foreign lands. With a swift, brutal thrust, Elias drove the long needle deep into the soldier's chest cavity. An audible, sharp hiss of trapped, pressurized air instantly escaped from the needle hub, sounding exactly like a punctured truck tire. Instantly, the frantic shrieking of the heart monitor changed pitch. The jagged, terrifying lines on the screen began to smooth out into a steady rhythm. The soldier's blood pressure began to climb, 80/50, then 100/60. The terrifying blue tint rapidly receded from his lips, replaced by the faint, fragile pink of returning oxygen. The young man took a sudden, massive, gasping breath. "He's stabilizing," the junior nurse whispered, tears of absolute shock and relief pooling in her eyes. "Oh my God, he's actually breathing." Elias didn't celebrate. His eyes were already scanning downward, cold and calculating. "Don't relax. That bought him 10 minutes. We still have a massive hemorrhage."
His hands shot to the soldier's left leg, ripping away the blood-soaked tactical pants. A jagged piece of metal from the armored hull had cleanly severed the femoral artery. Before Elias could demand a tourniquet, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay violently slammed open. 2 hospital security guards rushed in, their hands resting on their utility belts. Right behind them strode the hospital's furious chief of medicine, Dr. Sterling, accompanied by a towering, battle-hardened military colonel whose uniform was covered in ash and blood. "What in God's name is happening in here?" Dr. Sterling roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at Elias. "Vance, why is a probationary nurse performing surgery on a United States soldier?"
The heavy double doors of the trauma bay hadn't just opened, they had been thrown wide with the force of an explosion. Dr. Sterling, the hospital's chief of medicine, stood in the doorway, his face a mask of aristocratic outrage. Beside him stood a towering, imposing military colonel, his combat uniform dusted with concrete and ash, his eyes burning with a dangerous intensity. Flanking them were 2 burly hospital security guards, hands resting on their utility belts. "What in God's name is happening in here?" Dr. Sterling roared, his voice echoing off the sterile tile walls. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Elias, who was currently up to his elbows in the blood-soaked remnants of the young soldier's tactical pants. "Vance, why is a probationary nurse performing invasive procedures on a United States soldier?" Dr. Julian Vance, who had been standing frozen and useless against the wall, instantly seized the lifeline. His ego, bruised and battered by his own sheer incompetence, twisted into vicious self-preservation. "He went completely rogue, Dr. Sterling," Vance yelled, his voice shrill with fake panic. He pointed an accusing finger at Elias's broad back. "I was preparing an emergency thoracotomy to find the internal bleeding, and Thorne physically assaulted me. He shoved me away from the table, grabbed a 14-gauge needle, and stabbed the patient in the chest without authorization. He's completely unhinged." Nurse Brenda, hovering safely near the supply cart, nodded frantically. "It's true, Dr. Sterling. He threatened me when I tried to intervene. He needs to be arrested immediately." The imposing military colonel stepped forward, his jaw tight enough to crack stone. He looked at the chaos, the blood, and the young soldier lying on the table. "I don't care about your hospital politics," the colonel growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded instant respect. "That is my point man on that table. If your rogue nurse just killed him—" "He's still alive, Colonel, but not for long if we don't get him out of there," Sterling interrupted smoothly, trying to appease the high-ranking officer. "Security, get Thorne away from that table right now, restrain him, and call the police." The 2 security guards exchanged a nervous glance, but their orders were clear. They moved into the trauma bay, reaching out to grab the shoulders of the quiet, unassuming rookie nurse. They never stood a chance. Elias didn't even stand up. As the first guard laid a heavy hand on his shoulder, years of deeply ingrained, lethal muscle memory took over. Without taking his left hand off the massive, bleeding wound on the soldier's leg, Elias snapped his right arm up, trapping the guard's wrist in a vice-like grip. With a sickeningly fast, brutally efficient twist, he locked the guard's arm, dropping the 200-pound man to his knees in agonizing pain in a fraction of a second. The second guard froze, his hand hovering over his pepper spray, absolutely terrified by the blinding speed of the elderly nurse. "Listen to me very carefully," Elias growled, not even looking at the groaning guard he had just subdued. His cold gray eyes locked directly onto Dr. Sterling and the colonel. "This man has a completely severed femoral artery. The blunt force trauma shattered his armor plate, and the shrapnel sliced the vessel clean in half. He is bleeding out at a rate of 1 liter per minute. I am currently pinching the severed artery against his thigh bone with my bare hands," Elias continued, his voice echoing with a chilling, absolute authority that made the hair on the back of the junior nurse's neck stand up. "If you pull me off of him, the pressure releases. If the pressure releases, he bleeds to death in exactly 34 seconds. Do you understand me, Sterling?" "You arrogant son of a bitch," Vance screamed from the sidelines, emboldened by the presence of the chief of medicine. "You're contaminating the wound. You're destroying the tissue. We need to get him to an OR and prep for microsurgery. Let go of him." "He doesn't have time for a sterile elevator ride, you pampered hack,"
Elias roared back, his voice finally rising to a terrifying, deafening volume that completely silenced the room. He doesn't have enough blood left in his body to worry about tissue damage. He needs oxygen to his brain, and he needs it 5 minutes ago. I need quick clot combat gauze, and I need a Cat 7 tourniquet, right damn now. We don't stock military combat gauze in a civilian ER, Vance sneered, thinking he had finally won. You don't even know where you are, old man. The tension in the room was suffocating. The soldier's blood pressure alarm began to shriek again as Elias struggled to maintain the agonizing, crushing pressure on the artery. His forearms were shaking from the sheer physical exertion. The security guards were recovering, drawing their batons to physically beat him away from the table. Dr. Sterling was frantically dialing hospital police. Elias was entirely out of options, out of time, and surrounded by arrogant fools who were about to let a good man die on his watch. He had to make a desperate move.
The screaming in the trauma bay reached a fever pitch. Dr. Sterling was shouting into a wall phone, demanding hospital police. Dr. Julian Vance was frantically waving a sterile drape, barking contradictory orders at the paralyzed junior nurses. The 2 security guards, recovering from their shock, unclipped their heavy steel batons and advanced on Elias from both sides. Elias's forearms burned with lactic acid. His bare hands were buried deep in the soldier's mangled thigh, his fingers physically crushing the slick, severed ends of the femoral artery against the white bone of the femur. If he let go to fight off the guards, the young man on the table would bleed out before his heart beat 3 more times. Elias needed a miracle, and civilian hospitals didn't stock miracles for combat trauma. But soldiers did. Elias didn't look at the advancing guards. He snapped his head up, his piercing, cold gray eyes locking dead onto the towering military colonel who was watching the chaos unfold. "He's frontline infantry," Elias roared, his voice cutting through the panic with the unmistakable booming cadence of a battlefield commander. It wasn't a request, it was a direct, irrefutable order. "He has an IFAK on his plate carrier. Rip off his chest rig. Pouch on the lower left. Give me his Cat 7 and the combat gauze. Move." The colonel, a seasoned combat veteran himself, blinked in absolute shock. A civilian nurse wouldn't know what an individual first aid kit was, let alone where the standard operating procedure dictated its placement on a tactical vest. But the absolute authority in Elias's voice bypassed the colonel's conscious thought. Instinct took over. The colonel lunged forward, drawing a tactical knife from his own belt. He slashed through the soldier's heavy nylon webbing, ripping the trauma pouch free. He yanked out a rigid black tourniquet and a green vacuum-sealed package of quick-clot gauze, tossing them directly across the bloody table toward Elias. "Hand him!" screamed Dr. Sterling into the phone. The largest security guard lunged, grabbing Elias violently by the collar of his faded blue scrubs to drag him away from the bed. Elias didn't let go of the artery. Instead, he sharply dropped his center of gravity and violently twisted his torso. The sudden, brutal torque sent the guard crashing into the supply cart with a deafening crash. But in the violent struggle, the cheap, thin fabric of Elias's scrub top caught on the guard's grip. With a loud "reap," the entire right side of Elias's shirt tore open, from the collar down to his ribs, exposing his shoulder and chest to the harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma bay. The junior nurse gasped, physically covering her mouth. Nurse Brenda took a horrifying step back. Elias's exposed shoulder didn't look like human skin. It was a terrifying, jagged roadmap of thick, raised keloid scars, the unmistakable catastrophic signature of a massive point-blank IED blast that he had somehow survived. But it wasn't just the horrific scarring that froze the room. Dead center on his bicep, deeply embedded into the web of scar tissue, was a faded jet-black tattoo. It was a winged sword pointing downward, wrapped in chains, with a very specific, highly classified Roman numeral sequence tattooed beneath it. It was the heavily guarded insignia of a Tier 1 special mission unit, a ghost unit. Elias ignored the torn shirt and the horrified stares. His right hand snapped up, catching the tourniquet midair. Moving with a blinding mechanical speed that defied human biology, Elias used his teeth to pull the strap tight, threading the tourniquet high and tight around the soldier's thigh with one hand. He cranked the plastic windlass rod down with bone-crushing force, locking it into the clip. Instantly, the catastrophic well of blood in the wound stopped rising. The spurting ceased.
Elias ripped open the quick-clot gauze with his teeth and brutally packed the cavernous wound, holding immense pressure on the dressing. He stared at the cardiac monitor. The frantic, jagged lines smoothed. The blood pressure began a slow, agonizing climb. 80 over 50. 90 over 60. The soldier took a deep, shuddering breath, the oxygen finally circulating through his battered body. Tourniquet applied, high and tight, time 1400 hours, Elias barked, the deeply ingrained military protocol slipping out of his mouth automatically. He looked at the terrified junior nurse. He's stabilized. I need 2 units of O-negative blood on a rapid infuser, right now. Dr. Sterling slammed the wall phone down, his face purple with rage. He had missed the tattoo entirely, blinded by his own authority. You insane, arrogant butcher! You assaulted my security staff. Vance, get your team in here and prep the OR. We are saving this man despite this lunatic. Dr. Sterling pointed at the recovering security guards. Put him in handcuffs right now. The guards stepped forward, pulling heavy steel cuffs from their belts. But the military colonel wasn't looking at Dr. Vance. He wasn't looking at Dr. Sterling. The towering, battle-hardened officer was staring dead at Elias's exposed shoulder, his face completely drained of color. As the guards reached for Elias, the towering, battle-hardened officer slowly raised his hand, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute awe and disbelief, silencing the entire room.
Stand down. The colonel's voice didn't just fill the room, it commanded the very air within it. It was a low, dangerous growl that stopped the 2 security guards dead in their tracks. Their heavy steel handcuffs dangled uselessly from their fingers as they looked nervously at the towering military officer. Dr. Sterling bristled, his face flushed with aristocratic indignation. "Excuse me, Colonel. This man just assaulted my staff and performed an unauthorized, barbaric procedure on your soldier. He is a probationary nurse who clearly lied on his resume. I am having him arrested immediately." "You aren't arresting anyone, Sterling," the colonel said, his eyes never leaving the jagged, horrific scars and the faded winged sword tattoo on Elias's exposed shoulder. The battle-hardened officer, a man who had commanded thousands of elite troops, took a slow, deliberate step toward the blood-soaked nurse. Dr. Julian Vance, clutching his pristine, unused scalpel, scoffed nervously from the corner. "Colonel, be reasonable. I am the lead trauma surgeon here. That man is an orderly who just got lucky with a wild guess. He doesn't even know how to properly prep a sterile tray." The colonel finally tore his gaze away from Elias's arm and slowly turned to look at Vance. The look of absolute, unadulterated disgust on the officer's face made the golden boy surgeon physically shrink against the wall. "A lucky guess," the colonel repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "He just diagnosed and treated a tension pneumothorax in under 30 seconds without an imaging machine. He manually occluded a severed femoral artery with his bare hands while fighting off 2 grown men. He just saved my point man's life while you stood there sweating in your custom scrubs, preparing to cut his chest open and murder him." The colonel turned his back on the stuttering doctors and walked directly up to Elias. The towering officer stood at attention, his posture rigidly straight. He ignored the blood, the torn shirt, and the chaotic hum of the cardiac monitor. "The rumor at JSOC was that you were dead," the colonel said softly, the reverence in his voice unmistakable. "They said you took a direct hit from an 80mm mortar in Fallujah, trying to drag 3 wounded SEALs to a medevac. They said there wasn't enough left of you to put on a transport." Elias finally let go of the soldier's leg, the tourniquet holding perfectly. He grabbed a handful of sterile gauze, casually wiping the slick crimson blood from his massive calloused hands. His expression remained entirely unchanged, a stoic, impenetrable mask of calm. "The reports of my death were heavily exaggerated, Colonel," Elias replied, his low baritone voice steady. "I retired. I wanted a quiet life." Dr. Sterling looked wildly between the 2 men, his authoritative facade crumbling into sheer confusion. "Colonel, what is the meaning of this? Who do you think this man is?"
"Shut your mouth, Sterling," the colonel snapped, not even looking at him. He gestured toward Elias. "You arrogant fools have been treating him like a geriatric janitor. The man standing in front of you is Master Sergeant Elias Thorne. He spent 22 years attached to Tier 1 Special Mission Units. He has 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, and 3 Purple Hearts. He literally co-authored the military's manual on tactical combat casualty care." Nurse Brenda dropped her clipboard. It hit the floor with a loud, echoing clatter, but she didn't move to pick it up. Her face was entirely drained of color, her eyes wide with a sickening realization of exactly how she had been speaking to him all week. Vance's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The monogram stethoscope around his neck suddenly felt like a noose. He had just mocked one of the most elite trauma medics on the planet for his spatial organization. The colonel stepped back and, to the absolute shock of every civilian in the room, snapped a crisp, perfectly executed salute to the blood-soaked nurse. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you, Archangel," the colonel said, using the legendary call sign that was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in mess halls from Baghdad to Kabul. "My surgical team is landing on the roof in 2 minutes. We'll take the boy from here." Elias didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he simply offered a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the rank and the man. He threw the blood-soaked gauze into the biohazard bin with a heavy thud. The silence in the trauma bay was absolute, heavy and suffocating. The sheer gravity of their own arrogance crushed Sterling, Vance, and Brenda into complete, humiliated submission. They couldn't even look him in the eye. Elias walked past the stunned, motionless security guards. He stopped at the doorway, looking back over his shoulder at the pale, trembling chief of medicine. "Dr. Sterling," Elias said, calmly, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "I'm going to need a new scrub top, and someone needs to sanitize the waiting room chairs. I didn't get to finish." Without waiting for an answer, the master sergeant turned and walked quietly down the pristine marble hallway, leaving the shattered egos of St. Jude's Elite Medical Center burning in his wake.